as I said before, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Dave Hagenbarth, and I am the VP of Systems Engineering here at Pliant. And I'm joined by our VP of Sales, Chris Steele. And today we're going to walk you through a little bit about Pliant and a little bit about how Pliant helps integrate ServiceNow and other infrastructure items to actually drive some great process automation in your environment. So I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay and they can see my screen. So who is Pliant? Pliant really is an IT process automation platform. And what we do is we enable you with low-code, no-code UI, which I'll show you throughout this demo, the ability to connect all the different points and pieces in your infrastructure without actually having to code. So we're tying together all the process and systems you need, and today's demo will be about creating a virtual machine. But as we know, a virtual machine doesn't just stand by itself. It needs to have an IP address, and that'll come from something like one of the IPAM products we support. And it needs a DNS if you want to hit it by name, and that comes from also some of the IPAM products we support. Obviously, there's infrastructure. What network does it go in? What firewall needs to be altered so you can get to it? Is it part of a load balancer? Does it exist on-prem or in the cloud in Google or Amazon or Azure? So we support and facilitate the creation and connecting of all your infrastructure parts and pieces. What's unique is the low-code, no-code UI that we support. So on the left, what you see is a bunch of code that's Node.js that you would use to actually programmatically build a virtual machine, in this case, in AWS. On the right-hand side, what you see is what Pliant calls an action block. So we've taken all of this code and we've turned it into a block that you can drag and drop into your workflow to run your infrastructure. And I'm going to show you that in the demo as well. Just a little bit about Pliant before we get into this, the architecture. Down the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see some of the integrations we support. There's a whole long list. You'll see them as I go through the live demo. And that's what we call our integration repository. So Pliant is out grabbing manufacturers' APIs and turning them into those drag and drop blocks that I showed you on this slide, like the run instances block, so that you can automate your infrastructure. That's all part of the integration repository. The workflow editor is where we actually drag and drop those blocks, and I'll show you that. The real-time execution engine, this is where we actually execute the API or other commands that are needed to modify the infrastructure. And lastly, we have an event processor, a listener that takes inbound requests. And that's what we're going to see today in the demo from ServiceNow is ServiceNow makes a request to Pliant. Pliant performs a bunch of work and then returns the results to ServiceNow. And here's the use case that I want to take you through. Basically, we're going to go to ServiceNow. We're going to choose the size of the VM we would like. We're going to choose the operating system. We're going to choose some IP addressing. We're going to choose what platform we'd like to deliver that in. So we're going to deliver it in VMware or Openstack, Azure, or AWS. And then we're going to see as the process runs that the ticket gets updated with status and finally closed out with a working virtual machine. I'll take you through a couple different versions of this. One is using ServiceNow. Another is a portal we built to facilitate the same sort of thing. So there could be people out there saying, I don't use ServiceNow to do this sort of thing. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about how that works in an environment where there is no ServiceNow. And lastly, right before I go to the demo, I want to make sure that folks know where we are. We are pliant.io on the web. There's a bunch of resources in the resource library. You can find us on LinkedIn. Hopefully you've seen some of our posts. And we have a YouTube channel that'd be great if you wanted to go out and subscribe to. These webinars plus any of the other demos that we videotape all go into that library. Again, showing you how easy it is to use like a no-code, low-code UI to actually create this type of automation. So with that, I'm going to get right into the demo. I don't want this to be a long webinar. I simply want to get you interested. And when you have more questions, you can go to these resources. You can always click on Request a Demo, and any one of us would be glad to give you an in-depth look at this. This is going to be a very high level, very quick sort of overview. So I'm going to come into my ServiceNow instance first. So that's where we'll start our tour. I've built out a catalog entry called Pliant. And inside of Pliant, I have the ability to create a virtual machine. So when I come in, even though I've actually titled this VMware, we'll see in a minute that I can create it across any number of those cloud platforms. I can come in and pick my size. So how about a machine that has 1 core, 2 gig of RAM, and 20 disk? It's a pretty light machine, but it'll suffice. I have my choice of operating systems. So these come from a dynamically learned library of images that we have. And so I can pick any one of the different OSs. In terms of what subnet you'd like to collect or connect your VM to, I have my choice. If I collect all zeros, I actually am asking it to do DHCP. If I pick any one of these different ranges, then I'm going to get assigned an IP address. I do that mostly for my on-premise deployments. If I come down to the compute platform, I can specify IPs for Openstack or VMware. Azure or AWS would be DHCP candidates, probably. And then after VMware, I can specify the host name of this particular host. So I'm going to call it delete me because I'm going to have to delete this later. Anyway, so those are the entries. And what's going to happen is I do order now. I've set this up to be auto-approved. In a lot of places, you might go through an approval process where ServiceNow would send your boss or someone an email, and they would click approve, and then it would come back to here. In this case, I have an auto-approved order. And if I click on the request number, and then I click on the task number, we'll come in and we'll see that the state of the ticket is open. We'll see the credentials that I've asked for, and we'll see the status of what's going on. So we started by opening the ticket. We are now working on bind DNS. So we're creating a host called deleteme9.bind.pliant.xyz. We've been successfully allocated an IP address from, in this case, if I select VMware, I'm using Infoblox. And so Infoblox has found us the next available IP address. And then we'll go and take a look over in vCenter. And in here, we should see that we have a host, and he's already been created and powered on. If I go back to my ticket, we'll see that he's powering on VM280. So we've created this particular virtual machine with the 1 CPU, 2 gig of RAM, 25 gig of disk space that we specified, and we've connected it to our network. And then when it powers up, it's going to assign the IP address. And if we come back in here, we'll see here in just a second or so that we'll get an IP address assigned. I've also created the workflow to do a couple other things. I've asked it to actually ping the machine, and I've actually asked it to do a trace route to the machine from a remote host to create something that we call a birth certificate. So I have proof that when I actually created the virtual machine, I appropriately allocated all the things in the infrastructure I would need. So here we can see now that generating an email with the details in it. And then now we can see that this is complete. So we've been able to ping the address with 0 packets lost. We have our trace route hop times. If I come up here, you can see we've closed out the request. And also, if I come over to our CMDB, I can see that I've actually even added it as a configuration item. So I come in here, and we can see here that I've actually added delete me9, which you see was the host that we had here. And so he's been added to our configuration items database. We've updated, but the discovery source was this, his IP address was this. And if we come over, we should see an email here in a moment. There we go. And I've gotten an email that says, hey, by the way, you created a CentOS OS minimal, 1 CPU. I have the VM ID. I have his MAC address. I have his IP address. I have packets, his ping, and I have his thing. So we successfully used Pliant automation. What does that look like? So I'll take you over to the Pliant dashboard, and we'll take a look at that. This is the front end for Pliant. We can see here the number of last successful workflow runs, and this is the run we just called from ServiceNow. So we'll come in here, and we can see that at 1:39, we had our run. We tell you who ran it, demo ran it. We had it start at this time. It finished at this time. We assign a unique ID so that you can search it in your logs. And we also give you the output of the actual workflow run. So if there's some sort of auditing we want to do, all of the information you need to do that audit is in the log message. We do expect that these would get sent to something like Splunk or Elasticsearch. We don't want to be we're not trying to be a logging engine. We're simply trying to provide you all the information you would need for governance around your workflow automation. And a workflow looks like this. So we actually kicked off my ServiceNow workflow, and it looks a lot like this. This is the no-code, low-code UI editor that we used. As you can see down the right-hand side, I have my different sets of blocks. So I have blocks for AWS or Azure. I have the VMware blocks that we use to actually build out that virtual machine that you just saw. And this was the workflow that we actually used. So in the low-code, no-code world, we would come into something like ServiceNow, and we would do, most likely we were creating or updating tables. We can actually make new tables, we can delete tables, all the functions that you could do inside of ServiceNow, we've turned into these really cool drag and drop blocks. In my particular workflow, we start with assigned blocks, and these blocks are simply what you would do when you were programming something. They're just adding data to variables. And as we roll down, so we instantiate a bunch of variables, and then we actually go to the table, and that was that first update message you saw. So I updated the message in the ServiceNow with the start message, as you saw. Then I go and I call a workflow that goes out to Infoblox, and this workflow gets me that next available IP address. I then take the output of that workflow and I make it the input of the next workflow. And this one actually goes to bind and does a bind update with the host name and the IP address that we want. So now we have our host in our DNS solution. Then we sign some more. We have another update message with the fact that we've assigned that IP address. And the neat thing is, as we do our work, we carry those variables forward. And so I'm able to go in and assign a variable, and then from that variable, post it into ServiceNow. So what that looks like was back over in our configuration items. If I go back to that screen, and we see those updates here dynamically with what happens in the workflow. So I'm hoping that makes sense to everyone on the call. I now call my ability to build out. So I'm building out the virtual machine in VMware in this case. That block could be the block for AWS. It could be the block for Azure. It could really be any number of different blocks. I then update ServiceNow. I start the VM. So here's our block. It simply wants a VM ID, and I'm going to start the power, fire it up. After that, I update ServiceNow again. I then go grab the details around MAC address. So I loop through however many NICs there might be. I get the IP address, I get the host name and all those fun things. At the very end, I update the ticket, and I have lastly an email block that takes all of the variable information we collected and sent that email, which showed up over here. So that's a drag and drop workflow that basically we put together. Probably took us a couple hours tops. We used a couple of building blocks for bind. We use a couple of building blocks for Infoblox to go get the next available IP address in any given defined network in Infoblox. And then we use the VMware blocks to build out the virtual machine. And lastly, we use this email block to send the email out the door. So that's one look. If we look to, if there was a situation where you didn't use ServiceNow, we covered that as well. So we built out a dashboard here, which basically does the same thing. In this dashboard, we have our choice of OpenStack or VMware. And this is, again, using the Pliant workflows that you just saw. OpenStack or VMware. If I select OpenStack and I click Proceed, I can click Small, Medium, Large, or Extra Large again and Proceed. I am presented with a configuration screen. And all of this is just setting those variables that you saw in the last workflow. Whoops. I can pick a network. If I want to, I can static or leave it DHCP. I can add a username. Then I click proceed. I can pick, again, one of my templates that we have. Maybe I want to run Ubuntu, and I click proceed. And now I get a piece of information that basically says, this is what I'm going to build. And I click finish. And again, I'm going to get the email that says that it's been built on my OpenStack. And if I look into OpenStack, we can see that it should be firing up as we speak. Oh, and then logged out. I meant to mention at the beginning, if there are questions, please use the Q&A chat and we will answer them as we go, or we'll pick them all up at the end. So we can see delete me, and we're going to be active here and running. And so we'll go back over here. One thing I meant to show you in this was how we tie in, how we make the transition or the tie-in between ServiceNow or the website. But any of the workflows that we use, when you pull the blocks together, I'm going to drop this down at the very bottom here. If I click on See URL, we can see right here that if I want to tie, let's say, the website that I just showed or ServiceNow, and I want to call this particular workflow, I would simply use this particular RESTful endpoint as my call to execute the work that builds out the virtual machine. One last workflow. And this workflow actually builds a virtual machine in AWS. Another set of drag and drop blocks that we've put together. And if I run this particular workflow, we're going to actually go run a command that creates a key pair. And in the end, what I'm going to get, so I'll preface that, in the end of this, when this finishes running, we get a virtual machine running Ubuntu in AWS. And this time, instead of using Infoblox, we're using our cloud DNS provider, NS1, to do the DNS resolution for us. So very quickly, we run through, we get a key pair. We need the key pair because we're actually going to go and install Docker and then a virtual or a container that has a website in it. So we're going to run the instance. That means we're going to spin it up. And that was that block I showed you in the slide, right? All of the code we need is in here. One of the other things we do is wherever there are parameters needed, we actually build out a HTML form. So you can actually choose all the different values for all the parameters in an HTML form rather than having to code them in. Then we do a little loop. We make sure the instance is up. Once the instance is up, we've dragged over a couple of what we call generic or SSH blocks. And we're actually use those to SSH over to the virtual machine we've created using our key pair. We're going to actually install Docker. We've installed a container with a web server running on it. We've opened up port 80 on that machine. And then we went over to NS1. And we brought over our NS1 update record block or action block so that we could actually enter in the name and an address that we just got from AWS so that we could hit this machine in real time. I don't know if you noticed, but in the bottom of my screen, there was a dig command running. And when this workflow actually finished, we popped up that particular IP address as ns1.pliant.xyz. At the very bottom of the workflow, again, for governance, we've outputted the SSH key, the information on the box, such as the IP and whatever. If I toggle over to my NS1 portal and I refresh this, we can see indeed that we did take that IP address and put it in there. And then if I come in here and I type ns1.plemo.xyz, you see we have a very simple web page that has been automatically generated by the workflow. So that's a number of different ways that Pliant is utilizing this no-code, low-code drag and drop interface to very quickly and very easily build out workflows that produce this kind of output and work. So I'm going to bring this slide back up. And so everyone can see the resources. Again, you can follow us on YouTube. You can follow us on LinkedIn. And if there are any questions.
Yeah, and Dave, great job as always. I got a couple direct messages. First one is, so on slide 2, you had a bunch of different hardware vendors. I didn't see a vendor that's a critical component of our infrastructure. How do we get value if you don't have the integration today?
Great question. So we've covered off about 47 or 50 now of the major infrastructure vendors. But if we don't have a vendor in here, that probably means that we don't have action blocks for that vendor. And as part of your subscription, we will go out and get the APIs, or you may provide the APIs to us. So say Aruba, we have all kinds of wireless Aruba. We really want to automate our wireless, but you don't have action blocks to help us do that. We'll take the Aruba API, we'll ingest it, and we'll produce those action blocks for you free of charge with a 15 business day SLA. So we're going to import the API, we're going to export the blocks, and those blocks will then become available. One of the other things that I didn't mention on the architecture slide was this is a microservices environment. So these things are all different microservices. So when we go to update blocks, we don't have to update all the code. If we want to update the workflow editor with cool new things, we don't necessarily have to update the blocks. And lastly, the fact that it's microservices allows us to do two things. One, to scale really well. So we can scale to thousands and thousands of API calls per second if necessary. And we have the ability to deploy either on-prem or in the cloud. Natively, we run out of AWS, but there are instances where our customers would like us to run on-prem. And whether you're AWS-based or SaaS, or whether you're on-prem, we run the same train of code everywhere with a very simple way to update the code using microservices as an architecture. It allows us to do either very easily.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. And if there's follow-up questions on that, we're happy to answer offline, or you put it in the chat. And then we had one other question, Dave, and I'll let you take the first stab at it. I've used an RPA solution like Automation Anywhere in the past. Today we're using UiPath. How is Pliant different than those two solutions?
That's a great question as well. Pliant is similar in the fact that we're doing a lot of automation for you. We're similar in the fact that I think it's pretty easy to use. You're doing drag and drop. You're not having to write lines and lines of Python code. Where we differ is that we've focused in this infrastructure space. So we're making sure that you have the ability to make it every bit as easy to automate your infrastructure as you would a business process. So we feel like the RPA, the bots that have been targeted at helping you screen scrape and fill in different forms on the front side of all this, we feel like you should have the same level of ease and automation in the infrastructure as well. So we're allowing you to use these easy drag and drop blocks to sort of easily make workflows that modify the infrastructure rather than fill out a form in Salesforce.
Awesome. And then one final one, it looks like we have just a couple more minutes here. You demoed ServiceNow. We don't use ServiceNow for ticketing. What other ticketing systems could you integrate with?
So I showed the RESTful endpoint, which means that we could almost integrate with any ticketing system. We have worked on ServiceNow. We have worked on ConnectWise. But really that easy integration point, that RESTful endpoint that you can pass data to and APIs that we can call from, make it easy to integrate into almost any ticketing system out there.
Awesome. Any more questions from folks that are tuned in today? We have one more day, 2 more minutes here. Is this solution in production for any customer? Are there any reference customers, if required or asked by customers? And then a follow-up, which is SolarWinds. Can you highlight a use case on SolarWinds? So as far as Pliant being in production for customers, yes, Pliant is 100% in production with customers. Some key verticals and flagship names that you would be familiar with are from the financial services and service provider space. Happy to talk offline further. We just don't give out customer names, given NDAs that we have in place with them. And then as far as the SolarWinds use case, I love that you highlighted that one, Ron. Obviously, our team's intimately familiar with SolarWinds. Dave, not sure if you want to give a 30-second overview of that. We do have some great use cases of integrating solutions like ExtraHop and SolarWinds with solutions like ServiceNow. But Dave, not sure if you want to give a quick last-minute parting word on a SolarWinds use case that you like.
Absolutely. So we do have SolarWinds blocks. The use case that we've done to date, one of the best use cases did involve ServiceNow, but it involved tier 1 triage, where someone would call the help desk and a technician would fill out a ticket, and really what they needed was the user's name and their IP address. A lot of times they could look up that via Active Directory and DHCP. And then what we would do is we'd run a trace route from the user to the application IP that they were having a problem with. Then we took that information, you saw that in my email, the trace route data, but we take that information and then we would actually we would pull from SolarWinds each of the bandwidth counts for each of those hops in the path and some other flow data, and we'd roll that all up in the ticket, and all the tier 1 person had to do was basically fill in 2 IP addresses and push go, and they got back a whole lot of data that would have taken, a fair amount of time. You had to log into SolarWinds and find those interfaces. You had to actually do the trace route and everything. The other thing it provided for the business was triage worked the same way for every one of those cases where they talked about an application being slow or down or inaccessible. The tier 2, tier 3 guys had the consistent set of information to work from. And that's only one use case. There's also configuration, provisioning use cases we've done. There's validation and configuration or CMD updates. And we also can update SolarWinds with things like new community strings or new devices. So all those are valid SolarWinds use cases.
Awesome. And I just want to wrap up, want to be respectful of everybody's time and stay true to the 30 minutes. But we want to thank everybody for joining in. Dave, thank you for putting on a great demo as always. And we'll be sure to kind of distribute the recording of this demonstration. And we look forward to everybody tuning into the webinar that we're going to be doing next month, subject matter to come. But we appreciate everybody tuning in and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.